The garden was a cathedral of white flowers and glass, long tables draped in linen, crystal flutes that caught the afternoon like tiny suns, and a fountain that kept time with the ceremony. Guests sat in rows of soft chairs, faces polished and expectant. Cameras hovered discreetly, a harpist scattered music like silver dust. Eduardo stood before the arch, tucks razor-sharp, jaw clenched in a way that made him look both stubborn and afraid. The ring sat heavy on a velvet cushion in his hand. Milena approached on a cloud of silk and perfume, a smile mapped perfectly, a dress that had been sketched and paid for before the first toast. She moved as if every lens belonged to her. At the gate, a sound that did not belong rose, a hard, frantic pounding. A woman's voice, raw and urgent, howled for the house to open. It cut through the rehearsal of vows like a thrown stone through a stained-glass window. A hush ran the aisle. Waiters glanced toward the entrance. Some guests smiled as if this were a staged flourish. Others frowned, uncomfortable at the interruption. Milena's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She caught Vera's eye, a flick of annoyance, a curl of triumph. They had rehearsed every awkwardness for tonight. This would be solved, silenced, erased. Eduardo's hand trembled on the ring cushion. He turned, and for a sliver of a second, the world narrowed to the gate, and a figure collapsing against the wrought iron. A woman in threadbare layers, hair matted at the nape, cheeks hollowed by weather. Her coat was patched, her hands were red and stained with grime, but she held herself as if shame were a cloak she had learned to live in. Milena laughed softly, the sound a small knife. "Security," she said, loud enough for the nearest rows to hear. "Please make them go away." The woman pushed at the gate again. Her lips moved. Her plea was inaudible from where most sat, but it carried under the harps and the clinking silverware. "Eduardo, please." A dozen cameras could have recorded that name. It landed in Eduardo's chest like a small, sharp stone. The memory it triggered was not clear at first, no photograph, no tidy recollection, but more like the itch of a missing piece, a memory whose edges burned when he tried to touch it. He felt the air thin, the white around him seemed overbright, as if painted to hide fracture lines. "Who is she?" someone whispered near the aisle. The flowers blurred. For a beat time slowed, the world suspending itself until he could decide whether to step forward or let it fall into place without him. He took one step, then another. Voices chased him, confessions of taste, the low hum of gossipers adjusting their stories. He recognized some of them, investors, friends, faces that smiled with contracts in their pockets, people who had been with him when he signed the latest acquisition, the ones who liked things finished. The woman at the gate lifted her face. For a moment it was as if the years collapsed. The lines at her mouth seemed to soften. Her eyes, the color of worn denim, direct and tired, met his. Something like a crack opened in him. The ring weight grew unbearable. A soft, almost editorial voice in him said, "Ignore it." A louder voice, older, more protective, rose, "Go to her." Milena's hand found Vera's. "He won't be interrupted," she said, voice precise and poisonous. "This is our night." Vera, a woman of carved features and colder eyes, nodded. She had taught Milena how to be unassailable. Tonight had been circled in calendars and secured with contracts. There was no space for disruptions that had not been pre-approved. Eduardo walked to the gate. The crowd parted like water before him. At his approach, the woman's hands gripped the iron so tightly her knuckles shone white. He stopped a yard away and met those eyes again, and more than a name sparked. A ruined chapter of his life he had never allowed himself to read. Her voice was small. "It's me, Eduardo. It's Fabricia." Time cracked. Memories unspooled like film. He saw, suddenly and with the clarity of a photograph developed in a dark room, a younger version of himself, kneeling on a concrete floor in a half-light shelter. A little girl with a cough that rustled like paper leaned against his chest. A city that had always been loud suddenly seemed to hush around them. He had been younger then, angry in a different way. Angry at injustice, not at the world of contracts that would later consume him. He had brought her home that night, his arms full of something fragile and resolute. He had signed forms with a careful pen and blotted ink, promising himself he would keep her safe. They had called her Fabricia. He had thought those promises were kept. The music stopped. Conversation died. Milena's lips made a slow, deliberate smile. I said this would be perfect. He rescues broken things, and then people applaud him for it. Her voice had the sour sweetness of someone who measures charity by its publicity. Fabricia's hands rested on the iron. She did not flinch at the disdain. In the way she held herself, there was an accusation and a question. Why him? Why now? One of the bridesmaids covered her child's ears on instinct. Old money shifted in their seats. Eduardo's body remembered more than his mind. The scent of antiseptic, a name scrawled on a hospital bracelet, the riot of paperwork that adopted a life and then leaned away from it under pressure. He remembered a woman in a dark coat who had smiled at him across the hall of a courthouse, and then, months later, a notice. The child had been placed in protective care elsewhere. He remembered a blunt, legal language that became an exile. He remembered a silence on the phone that had been too final for any grieving. He had never asked how exactly that silence had been purchased. Now, standing in the sun with his bride and his life arranged as an exhibit, the missing part of him stepped into the frame and said, "I belong to you." Milena moved first. Her voice was sweet flame. "What do you want from us? Security will take care of you." Fabricia's smile was small and bitter. "I didn't come for charity," she said. "I came for him." A ripple of discomfort moved through the assembled guests. Some tittered, nervously delighted. Others squinted, trying to pass the texture of scandal. Eduardo heard the guilt like a bell. He turned away from Milena and saw not an enemy, but what he had been, a man who had loved and then let things happen because he was afraid of the scythe of scandal. He had believed his own cleverness could paper over a life. A soft voice in his ear, Tiago's, said almost aside, "Give me a minute." Tiago's hand touched his arm. Tiago had always been the one to move quietly, to open doors that needed opening. "Stay," Eduardo told him, his voice lower, wavering. He stepped back from the aisle toward the gate, where the woman waited with a patient ferocity that had no performance in it. The ceremony felt suspended, a rumor of wine glasses clinking faintly, as if to recall them to their assigned roles. But it was already too late for performance. The house had been breached by something that made performance meaningless. Then, because even the most careful evenings crack under life, a camera in the corner of the garden, one of the dozens placed to protect an expensive wedding from accidents and liabilities, caught something else. A slip of movement behind the kitchen door, a staff member hushing laughter as a woman in a dark coat passed false papers to a nervous man. The camera feed, meant to watch for spilled champagne and scuffling hedges, had recorded the edges of a plan. A waiter, eyes careful and hands steady, remembered the footage later and the way he had watched it over a scratched monitor, thinking only of closing his shift. He did not plan the hand that would change a life. Sometimes guilt arrives like a small stone in your shoe, and you cannot ignore it. After the initial shock, a single quiet line was heard from somewhere among the crowd, a soft instruction that made no one look up, but which, like a tremor, would realign everything. If this is about him, let it be done right. That was the soft CTA of a real human night. Stay and see. If you are hooked by what happens next, that voice seemed to say, follow the truth. Milena moved closer to Eduardo, as if proximity could stitch the wound. "This is ridiculous," she whispered, loud enough for anyone attending the front row to hear. "Some vagrant trying to wreck our night. We can handle this quietly." Vera's face had hardened into a mask that announced the cost of mistakes. "Don't make this difficult. Think of the people watching. Think of the image." The woman, Fabricia, looked at Eduardo. "They put me somewhere else," she said without accusation, only fact. "I fought. I wrote his name on every scrap of paper. I waited." Her voice carried a mileage of streets and waiting rooms and the slow calculus of survival. "I came tonight to tell him I forgive him for not finding me sooner." What she asked for was not vengeance. She asked for recognition, a memory unspooled into a more precise flashback, one that had been quietly buried. Years earlier, a winter where Eduardo had been consumed with work and a scandal about a company's layoffs. He had gone to a neighborhood himself, not for image, but out of a stubborn sense of guilt. There, behind a shuttered bakery, he had found a child crying because her mother could not pay for medicine. He had smoothed the child's hair, bought her soup, and then, after the night that lacked answers, signed papers that would root that child in his life. He had promised to be a father in a way that did not make it into any press release. He had named her Fabricia. Then the hand of ambition had come between them. Milena's entrance into his life had shifted him into a world where every deed was surveyed for optics. A woman like Vera, precise, patient, allergic to the unpredictable, had observed that this adoption could be a liability. She had mapped scenarios, threaded payments, and placed small obstacles where trust needed to pass. The child was taken into a different foster system. The trail grew cold. Calls went unanswered. Eduardo, distracted by acquisitions and investor meetings, let the story calcify into a memory too raw for reflection. In the present, the garden smelled of roses and something older, the scent of regret. Tiago, who had not only held the rope of Eduardo's secrets, but had sometimes pulled it taut to stop his friend from falling, had not been idle. Months before the wedding, he had noticed details: a paused invitation, a whispered call between Milena and a legal advisor, a pattern that suggested intervention. He had sent messages that Eduardo had not read. He had hired a small investigator to comb records. But what made the case unignorable was a different thing entirely: a pen drive. It came to Tiago through an unlikely channel. A waiter at a small restaurant, a venue where Milena had once met a fixer for a discreet dinner, had kept something after his shift. He had seen a conversation and a document passed across the table, a faded envelope with a name that matched a file Tiago had been chasing. The waiter had copied the footage from a backroom camera onto a drive, more out of a sense of wrong than a plan. He handed it to a friend of his who knew a journalist. The chain of small ethical choices eventually led to Tiago. Tiago watched the footage in a dim back room, the light of a laptop like a moon. The images were blunt and ugly in their intimacy. On the screen, Milena's smile was a weapon. Vera's hands were measured. A man in a suit took money and signed a paper. Laughter followed them like applause. The footage did not need narration. It laid out the exchange of favors, the placement of a child into the hands of strangers, the deliberate erasure of a life. At one point, someone in the video said, with a voice as calm as a clerk, "Make sure the paperwork goes through. He won't look twice." The words were not a legal claim. They were a confession, recorded in the small margin the world leaves open when people think themselves unseen. Tiago felt his mouth go dry. He burned hours verifying timestamps, cross-checking faces. He found the courier who had delivered the papers. He tracked the signature. Each breadcrumb added weight. When he finally carried the pen drive to Eduardo, the CEO of a company that could move markets, Eduardo did not reach for it immediately. He sat on a leather chair, the room quiet, watching the thin light of the laptop play a loop of what he had been allowed not to know. He watched as the camera filmed a version of himself that was not quite selfless and not quite cruel, a man whose absence had been sold as a mistake. He watched Vera's hand push the envelope, He watched Milena's laugh. He watched a paper that signaled the redirection of a child's life. When the footage ended, Eduardo put his head in his hands, and the sound of the world compressed into the small sound of his breath. Tiago waited, a presence steady and necessary. You can't just bring her back," Tiago said, "not as counsel but as a fact of life. Custodial laws, social services, reputations. That's not how their systems work." Eduardo lifted his head. He was a man who had built empires on numbers and on the patience of leverage. Now leverage had a face. "She was mine," he said simply, as if saying a name aloud could rearrange the world. "I signed for her. I put my name on her life." Tiago's eyes were sharp. "Then we do this with our eyes open. We don't make a theater of it. We prove what they did. We expose them. But be ready. They will strike back. They will call you reckless. They will make you look like the reason for every mess." He was right. The thought of litigation and counterclaims hung in the air, but the thing that pressed Eduardo's throat was not law, but truth. This was not a fight to win in court. This was a debt he owed to the ghost image of something he had taken for granted. They decided to assemble everything they could: the waiter's footage, the chain of documents, the witnesses. They would not climb into the cage of litigation first. They would reopen the wound publicly, where the witnesses were already gathered, where a lie could be unmasked by its own reflection. Back at the gate, Fabricia had not moved. She had come to the wedding with nothing but a small bag and the conviction that presence had power. She had known where Eduardo would marry. She had tracked him, not with the arrogance of a vengeance, but with the simple belief that someone who loved you once should have the chance to see you again. Her clothes smelled of the night and the weight of miles. She had asked for no pity. She wanted acknowledgement. Vera and Milena circled her in glances and barbs, their voices low and strategic. "Do you know what you could do to this family?" Vera whispered to Milena, playing the question like a weapon. "One scene, and everything crumbles." Milena's laugh was a blade. "Let her make a show," she said. "We'll make it look like a desperate stunt. He'll be embarrassed. He'll apologize to me publicly for this intrusion." She did not know. Perhaps she did. Perhaps she felt the possibility like a tremor under her boots, that some things, when cracked, refused to reassemble. Tiago returned, the pen drive now in a small envelope. He had arranged for a private room just off the garden. It was the sort of place where deals were signed and small illusions maintained. He did not explain. He walked straight to Eduardo and to the gate, where Fabricia stood like a waiting accusation. "You don't have to," Tiago began. "Yes, I do," Eduardo said more quietly. They moved away from the main crowd. Behind them the harpist resumed, putting a temporary balm over shocked faces. Milena's jaw tightened. She had rehearsed scenarios where any interruption could be managed. A quiet escort, a hush, an apology to the press. None had included the flash of a pen drive. In the small room off the gardens, with a glass of water and the faint smell of lilies that tried to cling to everything, Tiago slid the drive into a laptop. The footage that had been captured years ago, awkward, furtive, ordinary in its cruelty, began to play. Fabricia watched with a steadiness that had been carved by years of survival. She did not need the footage to know what had been done to her. She had lived it. But watching the recorded words, vile, pragmatic, orchestrated, changed something from private sorrow into public fact. She allowed herself nothing dramatic. She let the images do the speaking. Eduardo watched Mila and Vera on screen, as if for the first time. He watched damning smiles, the passing of money, the signature scrawled like a small, brutal punctuation. He watched a woman with his name on her lips, dismissed as collateral in the service of his social ascent. When the video finished, the room held its breath. For a moment, no one spoke. Eduardo felt hollow and furious. He had been a man who believed in the power of contracts. He had never thought the heart of him could be traded like an asset. He had been naive, he realized. He had been distracted by balance sheets and profit projections when the ledger that mattered had been kept by other hands. Tiago leaned in. "We can play this now," he said, practical as always. "We can put it on the screen. We can make them watch what they did. Or we can take it to someone who will do it properly. But you need to decide." Eduardo's fingers found the ring again, as if searching for a place to put the world into order. The ring felt alien in his hand, its gold bright and meaningless. It symbolized a life already arranged without the knowledge of the damage beneath it. The private room door opened just a sliver, and through the crack came the sound of Milena's laughter turning brittle as someone told a joke that missed. Moments later, a faint clatter. The sound of a champagne flute being set down with a little too much force. Outside, guests murmured and checked phones, sensing scandal but not its shape. Fabricia watched Eduardo, waiting not for pity but for a choice. She had rehearsed how she would take back the life that had been taken from her. But rehearsals are only scaffolding. The reality needed someone with power to lift a plank. Eduardo looked up at her. His face was a map of decisions he would have to make, of assets to shift, reputations to risk, of a woman he loved who stood at the other end of a life. He saw Milena, watching him like a hawk. He saw Vera, calculating the ripple of disaster and how to contain it. He thought of the little hospital bracelet with her name on it. He thought of the way her fingers had fit in his when she was small. He thought, suddenly, of the emptiness at the top of his table that he had never named. His voice, when it came, was low. "They stole her from me," he said simply. "They lied." Tiago's hand found the laptop, ready to send the file to every good-faith person who could make a difference. A lawyer, a journalist, a safe account. "We can do this today," he said. "We can put it up there and make them watch." Fabricia's eyes did not ask for more. "I don't want them punished in any way you don't choose," she said. "I want them to be seen. I want the truth to be public." There were other voices to consider. The investors who had come to toast prosperity, the family friends who would call up old debts and assign blame. There would be PR statements and denials, and the kind of legal hedging that slows moral urgency to a crawl. Tiago thought of all that and found it contemptible. Then Eduardo stood. The room seemed to shrink to the distance between him and the door. He put the ring down on the table, as if setting down a life that might still be rearranged. "We will make them watch," he said. "Not a threat, not a spectacle yet, a plan. But I will not make this about me. I will make it about her." He turned back toward the garden. Fabricia followed him out of the small room, not as a figure of pity, but as a woman stepping into the sun, with a quiet dignity that refused theatricality. As they reached the aisle, the guests were already craning necks, phones raised. The orchestra's strings had become hesitant. Milena's face had lost its mask. Vera's eyes were the color of certainty, the kind that believes in containment until the world proves otherwise. At the edge of the arch, Eduardo paused. He looked at the assembled faces, his board members, the socialites, the lawyers, the people who had once nodded at his jokes and bought into his narrative. He thought of the many polite lies that had built the dignity of this day. He thought of Fabricia's small, steady face. He thought of how she had kept patience like a light in a storm, how she had come tonight not to ruin but to be recognized. He could feel the weight of choices before him, announce the truth now, and watch the social structure he had lived inside tremble. Or retreat and try legality first, risking the silencing of truth in bureaucratic stalls. He walked to the stage and stood before the arch. The congregation leaned forward, waiting to see if he would continue the show as planned. For a breath, everything paused, like the hush before a storm breaks. Eduardo lifted his hand and let it fall open. The ring lay bare on his palm, bright and small. He looked at Milena, and something in his expression changed from indecision to a fierce, quiet resolve. "I will not marry you," he said. The words struck like thunder. Conversation collapsed into astonished silence. Chairs scraped. The harpist stopped mid-phrase, sounding a note that would not resolve. But he did not stop there. He turned, and with a motion that unstitched the entire fabric of the evening, he faced the woman at his feet, the one the world had tried to erase and who had come in the raw truth of her life. "I will marry her," he said, and the sentence hung, absurd and perfect. Gasps frilled through the crowd. Some hands lifted to mouths. A chandelier trembled as if in sympathy. Milena's face, which had been carved by careful practice, crumpled into something white and small. Vera's composure fractured into a thin, brittle grin that had no humor in it. Tiago moved, not to stop or to congratulate, but to make the chain of proof visible. He stepped to a technical table where a small monitor had been set up to play a slideshow for later. With a decisive hand, he pressed play. On the screen, the footage Tiago had assembled began to roll. Faces that had been polished in private exposed as they had been in public recording. Milena laughing, Vera instructing, hands exchanging envelopes. The language in the video was blunt, unembellished, and damning. The recorded confessions, words chosen by small, quiet cruelty, echoed across the garden. Milena rose like a statue under stress. "This is a lie," she said, calibrating shock and denial for effect. "This is sabotage. Someone is trying to ruin my reputation." But the camera had been careful. The voices on the screen were theirs. The signings were theirs. The man who took the money had not been an actor. The chain was visible and undeniable, and it moved like a small exorcism through the crowd. At the gate, a cluster of staff stared as if they had been waiting to be seen. A waiter, whose nervous hands had copied the footage months ago, watched the scene with a secret relief, his small action finally altering the axis of lives. Eduardo stood between the two women, his bride as expected, and the woman who had been erased. Around them the world shifted, and some things that had been hidden were no longer allowed to stay so. Fabricia did not look triumphant. She looked smaller, older, but present. She let the screen say what needed to be said. She kept her hands quiet by her side. The guests watched her with the hungry curiosity of people who like to see moral order restored in neat public ways. And yet, even as the footage played, the danger of making justice a spectacle hovered. There would be consequences, of course. There would be teeth-gnashing in boardrooms, apologies in newspapers, legal maneuvers designed to muddy the picture. But for the first time in years, her name had been spoken and matched with the truth. The last image the camera recorded before the feed was cut was of Milena and Vera standing together, a tableau for the ruin to come. Milena's face drained of color. Vera's attempt at stoicism looked like a thinly painted surface. Eduardo folded the ring into his palm and turned to Fabricia. The world had not yet forgiven him for delay. His own forgiveness would have to be earned by action, not apology. "Do you trust me?" he asked her, like a man asking for a map back to a place he had once lost. Fabricia looked at him, not with the naive hope of youth, but with a measured weighing of risk. "I trust you to make the truth public," she said. "I don't trust anyone to fix it for me." He understood the distinction. He would not be her savior. He would be her partner in the work of making the world remember. Beyond the immediate drama, something else shifted. The crowd's interest calcified into witness. They would be the ones to testify that there had been a betrayal. They would be the ones to feel the rumor as it turned from gossip into evidence. But the night was not finished, not by a long shot. Milena and Vera had power. They had friends in the right places. They had resources to turn light into fog. Tiago's plan had been pragmatic, Expose, then secure. Public evidence would force a response. For now, the garden was a courtroom peopled with the undecided. The music had turned to a low spot of violins, like the world drawing a breath before the next act. Eduardo folded himself into movement. He took Fabricia's hand, not as a possession, but as an offer. The camera's light caught them both, and in that small blaze of attention, something honest unfurled. At the gate, ignorant of the small complexities that would follow, a child sitting with a grandmother pointed and whispered. An elderly guest dabbed at his eyes. Socialites called for order. Somewhere, a phone began to buzz as the first messages of scandal were typed. The scene held for a long beat. Then doors began to move, voices mounted, men in suits who had been smiling only minutes before now balanced concern with calculation. The world was rearranging itself. And then, the sound of the house's security coming alive, of managers barking into radios, of a rustle of people who had prepared for such crises. Vera's hand moved to her clutch as if reaching for papers. Milena's carefully constructed calm was a spiderweb on which the first drops of rain had fallen. The moment had come to choose the scale and manner of the revelation. Tiago looked at Eduardo with that steady, necessary light in his eyes. "Are you ready for the consequences?" Eduardo squeezed Fabricia's fingers like an anchor, and steadier than he had been a minute ago, nodded. They would play the footage. They would let the world watch. They would make a choice that would not be easily undone. As they stepped back toward the arch, the ring in Eduardo's hand felt like a symbol whose meaning could be reinvented, not a claim to ritual, but a commitment to action. The crowd leaned in. The cameras, both the official ones and the small mercies of phones, turned like curious witnesses. Somewhere in the house, someone whispered a forecast of doom for the night. Milena's laughter had died. Vera's jaw clenched. The orchestra waited, the harpist's fingers poised but still, the entire evening suspended like a breath. And then, with the decisive motion of someone who had finally remembered what he had lost, Eduardo lifted the ring to his lips and let it fall with an audacity that made the world tilt. The footage on the screen wound down to the moment where the conspirators had been most comfortable, an exchange and a sealed fate. The guests watched, as if seeing the inner workings of their social machine being shown the way a mechanic lays a clock open on a bench. Outside the noise of the staged world, a small set of facts began to work like a lever. The waiter who had copied the footage felt his chest unclench. Tiago set his jaw in the way a man does when the map becomes clear and there is no more room for doubts. And behind all of it something else stirred, the old fear in men like Vera and Milena that social capital once spilled does not easily dry. At the edge of the garden, Vera's face went blank, and then bright red. She hissed a name at Milena, a private curse, and then moved to the periphery, calling someone on her phone with fingers that trembled. Milena, for all her poise, looked like a woman who had been unmasked in a mirror by a child who refused to look away. The performance had failed. The world she had bought with flattery and agreement had refused to remain obedient in her presence. There were consequences in motion that neither she nor Vera could yet imagine. Small fractures in alliances, sponsors worrying, a public figure's name spoken next to corruption. The social predator net would have to be rewoven. For now, however, the only thing that mattered was that Fabricia had been seen and recognized, and that Eduardo had chosen to turn a life back toward something he had once promised to protect. The garden watched, and the world began to tilt toward verdict. They had made the evidence public. They had moved past apology into accusation. The next moves were not yet visible, but the first had been enacted. The ring left his finger. The camera had shown what it needed to show, and the bride had been cast into an unanticipated role. As the violins swelled and voices rose, some in outrage, some in defense, some in the dry amusement of scandal, Eduardo felt a kind of clarity settle into him. He had been a man of tidy solutions and negotiated deals. Tonight he had chosen something untidy: truth. His choice would cost him a life that had been planned, a brand polished to a shine. It would force him to rewrite not only his evening but the map of his alliances. Yet he felt now that cost as a relief rather than a punishment. Fabricia squeezed his hand back, not as a plea for marriage or salvation, but as a pact that this would be done honestly. The cameras would remember, the guests would bear witness, and somewhere beyond them, in the rooms of power that had once seemed impenetrable, a different kind of calculation was already forming: how to survive being known. The garden hummed with the electricity of exposure. People reached for their phones, for their counsel, for their versions of the narrative that would suit them best. For a brief, astonishing moment, the world tilted toward rightness. Then, as voices rose and the night began to braid itself into 1,000 retellings, a pair of security guards moved toward the gate with brisk efficiency. They spoke into radios with clipped tones. Vera, watching them, felt the first cold of losing control. But nothing, not speed, nor power, nor premeditated cruelty, could erase the footage, now rolling in many places, nor the fact that a man with money had finally turned it in the direction of justice. And though the night had only just begun, the first chapter of reckoning had been written in a way that could not be easily unmade. Still, before the fallout could be contained, there was one thing left to do: make a choice not only to unmask, but to repair. The public drama could expose the injustice, but repair required time, humility, and action. Eduardo stepped forward, toward the crowd and toward the woman who had returned to claim what had been hers. He moved with a confidence forged not from his status, but from the sudden clarity of purpose. And as he reached for Fabricia's hand once again, the garden listened, the cameras, the watchers, the men who thought themselves untouchable, all witnesses to the first messy act of doing right. They did not let the night dissolve into chaos. It was Tiago who, with a steadiness that had steadied Eduardo through worse boardroom storms, ordered the mechanics of exposure into motion. A short, factual press release drafted by the company's legal PR team, a controlled list of media contacts, an immediate notification to a handful of ethical journalists who had refused payoffs in the past. He had learned to move with the precision of someone who understood how noise could spiral into myth if left unattended. He did not try to spin the truth. He made sure the truth could not slither away. Milena moved like a woman whose script had been burned. She had rehearsed 1,000 answers to 1,000 possible scandals, lines that would call for tact, lines that would assign blame to photographers, to the press, to the opportunists who wanted to mete out a spectacle. Nothing had prepared her for footage that showed her smile while money changed hands. Her lips trembled not from sorrow, but from fear, the first honest tremor of a woman who realized that social currency had been spent, and no one would loan her more. "Don't do this," she hissed at Eduardo, voice bright as a cut onion. "You don't have to be dramatic. We can fix this. We can pay for damage control. We can—" "No," he said, and the single syllable was not cinematic. It was exhausted, final. "I will not spend my life whitening a shade that was painted to hide a crime." She tried to pivot. "Make it about me," she demanded, not convincingly. "Say I was set up. Play the victim. In our circles, sympathy buys time." Vera, who was never much given to public displays that weren't calculated in advance, scanned the lawn as if inventorying which alliances to burn to save what remained. She barked orders into a phone with fingers that did not quite stop shaking. She tried to call the studio, the designer, the charity boards that accepted her checks and her name. Some answered with courtesy, conditional measured. Others, who had watched the footage with a mixture of horror and relief, they too had been waiting for permission to abandon a sinking partnership, began to distance themselves with the speed of people who reckon reputations like portfolios. A well-placed sponsor, who had once enjoyed the glow of Milena's image on campaigns, sent a terse message that read like a small guillotine. "We cannot be associated with this." Her modeling agency issued a cautious statement about ongoing review. Invitations that had once been guaranteed began to close like folding doors. That night some guests huddled in corners and murmured about scandal as if it were an exotic dessert. Some left quietly, having had enough spectacle for the season. Others, older acquaintances who had watched Eduardo's rise and had quietly suspected something of his tender heart, stayed as witnesses. A few sat in stunned silence, caught between loyalty and the slow, inexorable sense that they were being asked to observe a wrong being set straight. Tiago's hand moved fast. He had recorded the footage on several drives. He had copies with journalists and with a trusted investigator. He sent encrypted clips to reporters who had a track record of pursuing facts without sensationalism. Within hours, a few outlets ran a sober account, a headline that did not scream but did not let the matter fizzle. Evidence surfaces in case of missing child, linked to Billionaire's household. The overnight reaction was a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Among the social feeds, there were those who had come for spectacle, but among them were others who recognized a deeper failure, a system that allowed the vulnerable to be made collateral for social climbing. The story did not level judgment in immediate theatrical terms. Instead, it forced an uncomfortable question into morning coffee. What happens when wealth and image are allowed to substitute for responsibility? Milena, who had expected calls from PR strategists and private advisors, found herself hearing polite deferrals and mentions of pending internal review. Vera, used to the soft echo of affirmative answers, found some doorways quietly closed. A friend she had backed into a board seat simply did not pick up the phone. The next morning, the house woke to a different soundtrack, not the clinking of crystal and the soft sweep of festivities, but the thin, grating buzz of phones. The news had reached corners the guests had not anticipated. Reporters called. Friends wanted statements. People who had once smiled with profit in their eyes now asked logistical questions about outcomes. Beneath it all ran the quieter, more dangerous current of opinion. People had chosen sides. Eduardo spent the night not in the gilded master suite he would have occupied if the evening had gone as planned, but in a spare office where he had once gone to think through old regrets. He sat with Tiago and with a legal counsel whose face had learned to be calm when facts were hard. Fabricia had left the house that night alone. She had insisted on a small walk by herself, needing the press of ordinary pavement under her feet more than chatter. Later, Eduardo found her at a bench near the hedge, the city lighting a soft kind of quiet on her face. She smelled of the night, of damp pavement, and the faint sweetness of a pastry she had bought on the way. She did not come with expectations of instant domestic rescue. There was no melodramatic demand in her eyes. There was, instead, a formidable, iron steadiness that had been forged slowly by having to take small, deliberate steps in a world that often disapproved of their courage. "You don't have to accept anything from me," Eduardo said when he sat beside her. His voice had the wear of someone who had been in a long trench and had finally climbed out to see the sky. "I know," she said. "I came to tell you I forgive you for not finding me sooner, not so you could spend the rest of your life apologizing, but so you would know why I came." He closed his eyes briefly. "Forgiveness has a cost," he said. "Not for you, for me. I have to dismantle all the ways I allowed it to happen." "What do you want me to do?" she asked, not as a plea but as a practical consideration, like a person who organizes what must be moved in a fire. He took a breath. "I want to make sure you are seen, not as a prop, not as a symbol. as a person who was taken from a life and returned the truth. I'll make sure the record is corrected where I can. I'll fund the investigation. But I will not decide what your life will look like." She looked at him, and he saw the grim patience that had kept her alive, the patient refusing to be broken. "I don't want to be saved by anyone who thinks they can buy me back," she said. "If you want me in your life, make me part of the life, not something you rescue then put on a shelf." Eduardo nodded. "Then I will begin by listening." They made a deal that was less cinematic than the garden had been the night before. He promised practical things he could deliver without fanfare, access to records, an offer to finance legal counsel of her choosing to investigate the paperwork that had rerouted her life and, if she wanted it, support to re-establish her identity in the way she saw fit. He would not make decisions for her. He would instead use his resources to make sure the truth could be both found and kept in the open. In the days that followed, the apparatus of non-fiction moved like a careful machine. Tiago and the legal team compiled the evidence, the footage, bank trails, courier receipts, signatures on documents filed in haste. They did not stop at the smoke and mirrors. They traced the payments that had been made to the broker who had ensured the paperwork went through, followed email trails, recorded testimonies. Where facts were unclear, they looked for patterns. They did not manufacture anything. They let the real world of ledgers and timestamps do the heavy lifting. Milena and Vera attempted countermoves that were at first petty and then increasingly frantic. They released statements that danced around direct admissions and accused unknown actors of manipulation. They tried to pin the scandal on opportunists who wanted to ruin an image, but the footage was not the fever of rumor. It was recorded action that showed hands and voices, names passed in low tone. It could not be easily smoothed into a PR-friendly fog. Sponsors began to pull back. A charity that had listed Vera as an honorary patron removed the name from its website with little fanfare. Restaurants that had once reserved tables in Vera's honor found their bookings quietly cancelled. For Milena, glossy pages that had once paid handsomely to place her face now called for audits and contractual reviews. An editor who had relied on her social cachet told a mutual friend, gently but firmly, that policies would not be violated to save a brand. The social fall was not instantaneous justice. It was a slow unthreading, like pulling at a seam until the embroidery came undone. Vera, who had once managed crises with a magician's hand, found calluses in the places where people had once kissed her crown. The circles she had polished her name in closed doors. Her bank of favors was suddenly bankrupt in emotion. But reputational collapse is not always proportional to moral culpability. It is proportional to the perception of culpability and the speed with which people can distance themselves. Because the camera had been steady and because Tiago had made sure facts existed outside rumor, the perception hardened into consequence. In the quiet legal office midweek, a lawyer with patient eyes explained their next moves to Fabricia and to Eduardo. They could pursue civil options, challenges to the validity of the custody paperwork, and they could file complaints with child welfare agencies about the improper rehoming. The lawyer spoke measuredly of bureaucratic slowness and of the kinds of battles that require both patience and public pressure. Fabricia listened not with grief, but with intent, the way someone listens to the instructions for a tool they mean to use. "How long will this take?" she asked. "Long enough to be exhausting," the lawyer said honestly, "but not forever. We can make sure the record is right as we wait." Fabricia nodded. "Then we start." In the weeks that followed, she did not become a figurehead at Eduardo's side. That had never been her way. Instead, she became a person with projects and decisions. With funds Eduardo quietly organized, she hired a small team of advocates and paralegals and began to reconstruct the life that had been taken. She reached out to women she had met in shelters, to social workers who had once spoken to her with more kindness than pity, and to lawyers who specialized in family reunification. She insisted on autonomy. Any program she accepted would be led by people with lived experience as well as technical competence. Eduardo watched her with a mixture of admiration and a new kind of humility. The man who had built skyscrapers and negotiated mergers found himself in meetings about foster care regulations and the mechanics of record access. He learned the difference between funding and understanding, between donating money and sustaining change. He made mistakes. He offered solutions she did not want. He suggested publicity when she asked for discretion. But he learned fast. He let Tiago be the firewall where he needed a buffer, trusted the council of specialists, and slowly, through patient correction, made himself useful without commandeering. Milena's attempts at recovery were uneven and often self-destructive. She hired crisis managers who had once steered lesser scandals back to safe harbors. But this was a scandal with a stubborn through-line: evidence. She lashed out at people who left. Sometimes she lashed out publicly in interviews that did not help. Her face, which had been made profitable by controlled angles and practiced melancholy, now appeared in headlines that spoke of betrayal and moral cost. Offers that had once been simple contracts were now tied to moral clauses and opt-outs. She learned abruptly that the currency of favor could evaporate depending on how the market valued ethics. Vera retreated, not wholly into private shame, but into a network of smaller, quieter entreaties. Calls to old allies, attempts to broker settlements, offers of hush funds. Those around her were less willing to be complicit. People who benefited from her access and friendship found that association with her now carried risk. Solidarity with the powerful is a conditional thing. When their climb is built on other people's suffering, allies are less inclined to climb with them. Not all the damage was public. There were private, bitter conversations. A friend who had once toasted Milena over champagne now called to say they could not continue a partnership. A designer who had once offered couture on credit quietly retracted. Money, the great lubricant of the circles they moved in, withdrew with astonishing speed. Meanwhile, the media attention did what Tiago had hoped it would, if slowly. It forced institutions to look. It encouraged a foster care agency to open an inquiry. It encouraged a notary's office to review a signed file that had once been closed like a book with a lock. The system's slowness remained as institutions favored stability over rupture, but there was new pressure, public witnesses who cared enough to ask questions. There were also those small, stubborn bits of kindness that do not make headlines. A neighbor bringing a bag of groceries, a former volunteer in a shelter writing a note to help locate a witness, a waiter who had once copied that first footage, finding quiet relief as reporters asked him questions and treated him with dignity rather than curiosity. Fabricia received these not as consolation prizes, but as tokens that the world could show up differently. Months after the wedding that never was, the arc of daily life began to include things that were not about scandal. Fabricia secured a modest apartment with a small garden and the space to host a few women for dinners. She started a small program that taught job skills and self-advocacy, simple, practical things that felt like the kind of reparative work that did not require ribbon cutting. Eduardo visited, not with a public entourage, but with a bag of books he thought might help the young women in the program. He listened often, and when he had ideas, he asked rather than imposed. There were still hard days. Some nights Fabricia woke with the old memory of a courtroom's language, of forms signed by hands she had never met. There were moments when public attention turned to some other story, and the momentum that had forced institutions to look slowed. But these were the kinds of setbacks she was prepared for. Not the dramatic reversals of filmic cruelty, but the boring, grinding attrition of systems that change only when people keep at them. Eduardo found new work to do that did not involve a staged announcement. He set up a trust that funded legal assistance for families seeking to challenge improper custody moves. He trained a compliance team at his companies to audit philanthropic work, to separate the warmth of public relations from the cold reality of documented outcomes. He used access. He had to open doors not as a favor, but as a means of transparency. Contracts with charities required public reporting, donations were tied to outcomes, and people who had been assisted were offered seats on advisory boards. It was procedural, sometimes boring, often resisted by donors and managers, but it began to bend the arc of practice ever so slightly. The public, which had been hungry at first for scandal, grew accustomed to a quieter story, a woman whose life had been interrupted by greed and restored by painstaking truth, a man who had chosen a wrenching humility over comfort, antagonists who, stripped of power, retreated into the brittle palace of their own making. Milena attempted a comeback that was characteristically theatrical. She staged a small interview in which she insisted she had always conducted herself with integrity and accused unnamed forces of targeting her. It did not land. The public, which had watched the footage and seen her manner in a different light, met her attempt with a kind of impatient refusal. Fashion houses that had once assured her of runway slots now hesitated. Invitations still arrived, sometimes, but they were measured. The world she had mistook for infinite attention began to reveal its scarcity. Vera found what she had always feared. Influence that depended on secrecy could not survive daylight. She attended a meeting with a group of patrons where, for the first time in years, people spoke their considerations out loud rather than in whispers. "We can't risk our institutions," one said, "not on the possibility of rumors." Her network thinned. She called people and heard nothing. Her calls migrated to voicemail, the kind of social exile that feels harsher to those used to power. There were also quieter reckonings that did not involve headlines. A man who had taken money in a backroom meeting was asked to come forward. A broker who had processed the paperwork received notes from people who demanded answers. A courier who had once acted on instructions found himself called in for questions. They were not cinematic arrests. Instead, they were the legal, bureaucratic framework of consequences. Some paid fines, some recanted, some, exposed by their own small recorded confessions, had to adjust to reputations they could not salvage. In a small, sunlit office that looked out onto a courtyard, Fabricia and Eduardo sat with Tiago and the lawyer months after the garden incident and reviewed the list of practical restorations. Access to original records, a public statement correcting the historical record, a small financial settlement that would allow Fabricia to launch the programs she wanted without dependency. They did not speak of marriage as a balm. They spoke of partnership and dignity. "You saved me in a way," she said suddenly, looking at Eduardo. "Not with your money, by not letting this be hidden." He shook his head. "I failed a long time ago. You had to survive. If anything, you saved me from pretending I was better than I was." She smiled, not an easy, quick grin, but one that recognized the distance they had walked. "That will have to do for now." They did not rush to exchange vows. When the time came for them to make a public statement, because truth needed to be documented as much as it needed to be felt, they did so with a kind of subdued dignity. The statement was simple, an acknowledgement of wrongs, a commitment to cooperate with authorities and institutions, and an announcement of a foundation that would assist families in challenging improper custody transfers and ensure more transparency in the administration of social services. Fabricia's name was on the foundation as an equal partner. She insisted on that. She insisted that the board be composed partly of people who had lived experience and partly of trained professionals. Eduardo agreed, and used his connections not to dominate, but to guarantee independence. The first time the foundation held a small meeting, it was unglamorous. A rented community space, coffee in paper cups, a handful of volunteers, and a few local reporters who had followed the story, not because it was sensational, but because it had become meaningful. Fabricia stood at the front and spoke about the ways the system had let her vanish, and how the power of seeing and of records had returned a part of her life. She did not speak as a martyr. She spoke as someone who had been wronged and who wanted to use the resources available to make the path less likely to be repeated for others. There were small victories. An agency agreed to a review of a family's case on the strength of documentation. A courier came forward and testified to pressures he had received. A notary office disciplined an employee who had disregarded checks. There were also setbacks, hearings delayed, offices closed for bureaucratic holidays, people who tired of the long slog and withdrew. But the process of restoration was not a single roar of triumph. It was a long, purposeful series of small, stubborn steps. And through all of it, the emotional work continued. Fabricia sometimes wanted nothing to do with the public life around Eduardo. Other times, she used his influence to bring attention to a case that needed it. They negotiated, sometimes clumsily, how to be in each other's lives without bending to the myths people wanted to make of them. They built something messy and real. Dinners with friends who had become advocates, quiet afternoons, working through stacks of paperwork, a small garden where Fabricia grew herbs that she would later bring to community dinners. Milena tried occasionally to reach out with conciliatory notes. Sometimes they arrived as flowers with notes attached. Sometimes they were voiced by mutual friends who asked for a chance at reconciliation. Fabricia rarely answered. When she did, it was brief and practical, requests for apologies in specific terms, and sometimes no response at all. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not always a public achievement. An apology without accountability felt like a counterfeit coin. Vera, on the other hand, aged in a way that was not solely physical. She spent time trying to negotiate settlements, to find a way back to relevance. In late-night phone calls that she once used to plan coups of social capital, she now pleaded for basics. The hunger for control was still there, but with fewer buyers. Not everything resolved. Some relationships splintered permanently. Some friends chose sides and never looked back. Others returned, tentatively, late in the game when they saw the steady, careful work of rebuilding. Months down the line, at a modest ceremony that Fabricia insisted be intimate, she and Eduardo announced the formal launch of the foundation. They did not use the stage for a personal marital announcement. Instead, in the small room, crowded with volunteers, social workers, and a few honest reporters, they explained the Foundation's mission: to assist placements, to fund legal advocacy for families, and to push for transparent record-keeping in adoptions and foster care. When a woman in the audience, someone who had once waited for months for a legal answer that never came, stood to speak, her voice choked with gratitude, Fabricia felt a fierce, quiet joy. That joy was private and communal, the rare kind that rises from doing good, that has the face of ordinary people attached to it. Eduardo watched from the front row as Fabricia led a discussion with the simple authority of someone who had been there. He had never seen leadership like this in any boardroom, not the polished performance of a PR strategy, but the honest, unsparing work of telling the truth, of calling the system to account and then bending resources toward repair. After the meeting, they walked outside together and stood in the small garden that had been planned for quiet conversation. The sun was late, the air crisp. Birds moved through the trees like punctuation marks. "You never asked me to marry you again," Fabricia said with a wry little smile. He looked at her. He could have made the night a big, sweeping thing. Flowers, cameras, vows. He could have used the ring as theater to close a narrative. He had, in the garden under the white arch, made a choice that was spectacle enough. He had offered a life in which she would be seen and heard and supported. Now there was a possibility of something else, a life built from shared action rather than from an instantaneous romantic resolution. "I don't know what I want tomorrow," he admitted. "I know what I want now. I want to be the man who helps fix what was broken." She took a breath and leaned into the small, uncompromised truth they had built. "Then start there. Let us build life from that." He laughed softly, mirthless and full, sensible and stubborn. "I like that." She smiled. "You will have to be patient." He reached for her hand. Their fingers, braided the way two people who had been through the same storm, sometimes hold each other, not with a desperate grasp, but with mutual steadiness. Outside the meeting room, reporters still lingered and called names into phones, but the story that consumed the tabloids had been supplanted by subtler narratives. Community work, a quiet foundation, the slow administrative work of reform. The scandal remained in the memory of some. For others, it had become the reason to finally take a tiny, inconvenient step toward justice. And life, which had once been ordered by the illusion of perfection, rearranged itself around something more human, vulnerability acknowledged and then acted upon. In the months and years that followed, Fabricia's programs grew in modest, durable ways. She opened a small resource center that offered legal aid, counseling, and job training. Eduardo used his connections to ensure the center had access to pro bono specialists and sustainable funding, but he did not make himself the face of its operations. He sat on the board as a supporter, visible when needed, quiet when not. Fabricia sat in the director's chair and made choices that sometimes infuriated donors. They learned to laugh about his tendency to present spreadsheets at staff meetings. The public, which had once wanted spectacle, settled into a warmer curiosity. People who had once reduced Fabricia to an image of tragedy now saw her as a thoughtful leader. Some of Milena's former circles faded, others recirculated cautiously. The lessons of the garden never entirely vanished. They remained like a relic you could look to when moral questions came up. A reminder that seeing, naming, and acting matter. Occasionally, Fabricia walked past the hedge where the wedding had been intended and remembered the first pounding at the gate. She did not savor a feeling of victory. She felt a quiet, layered sense of what had been taken and what had been returned. She had not entered the mansion to seize a life of ease. She had walked through a gate to say one truth to one man who had once promised. In the end, she had reclaimed not only name and record, but a voice she used to help others. The world did not become a place of neat endings. There were still hard policy fights in the halls of administration and moments when systems resisted change. But the foundation was a small, steady lever. People who had been ignored now had advocates. Records were kept more meticulously in some offices because auditors were sent, not to penalize but to ensure transparency. Milena and Vera, where they remained in the public eye, did not experience dramatic retribution. They experienced isolation. They found their invitation shortened, their influence reduced to a narrower circuit. Vera took to private counseling that did not cure whatever ambitions had constricted her. Milena, after a few abortive attempts to reconcile with public favor, retreated from some aspects of public life and started, awkwardly, to build a smaller, less luminous career, one without the force of scandal-driven spotlight. They still had resources, they still had choices, but the dramatic power they had wielded in the garden had been curtailed. At a quiet anniversary a year later, a small group gathered in the resource center to mark milestones, families reunited, legal victories, and children whose cases were finally being heard. The press did not make a circus of it. The room was full of the kind of modest hope that waits to be counted not by page views, but by lives steadily improved. Iago, who had sometimes scolded Eduardo and sometimes carried his secrets like a second skin, watched Fabricia speak to a woman whose case had been stalled for years. He gave Eduardo a look that said without words, "You did the thing that mattered." Eduardo squeezed Iago's shoulder and then looked at Fabricia as she laughed, with someone who had been helped. It was not the scene of a movie finale. There were long days ahead. There were political and bureaucratic battles they had not won. But for the first time in years, a portion of Eduardo's life was aligned with what he had once promised that little girl under the shuttered bakery. Not a neat redemption, but consistent, corrective acts that would outlast headlines. When the small ceremony ended, Fabricia stepped outside, and the city air felt like a promise rather than a threat. She turned to Eduardo and to the handful of people who had watched the slow, stubborn work of repair and said simply, "We did what we could." He nodded, eyes damp with more than regret. "We will keep doing it," he said. "We will keep at it until the record matches the truth." They did not kneel before camera lights, nor did they choose vows that belonged to a fiction. They chose, instead, to continue in the long, unglamorous work of mending, petitions filed, records corrected, programs run, lives reclaimed. Some people called it a quieter kind of justice, others called it realism. For Fabricia and Eduardo, it was simply the only honest path they could see. A year on from the garden that had split a life into before and after. There were afternoons when Fabricia walked into a classroom in the center and taught young women how to write a resume, how to speak in a meeting, how to insist on documentation. She taught them not to wait for someone else to fix the system, but to work within it and around it. On one of those afternoons, she stopped in the doorway and watched a woman she had once helped, now employed, teach another how to use an application form. Fabricia felt something like peace, the steady, generational shaping of consequence. In the distance, life kept moving. The world sometimes forgets the particulars that made scandal news, but it does not forget those things that build capacity. Something persistent and smaller had been set in motion. They did not become a fairy tale couple. They became something more useful, two people who had shared a violent public rupture and then turned to the long labor of repair. They learned to be partners in action and in restraint. They learned to hold their love not as a shield, but as a tool, to be shaped rather than wielded. And when people asked Fabricia, in quieter interviews and in community meetings, about forgiveness and endurance, she answered with a truth that was both blunt and generous. Forgiveness is not erasing what happened. It is choosing what to build with what is left. Outside the city, somewhere a woman who had once been called a social climber checked her phone and found that invitations had dried up. She sat in rooms that had once vibrated with agreement and now hummed with cool caution. She had used image as currency and had learned that currency is perishable when built on the suffering of others. The garden where the wedding had been planned remained in time, a place people rented for events that required beauty. But for those who had been there that day, the arch and the hedges carried a different resonance. The memory that a single person's refusal to accept silence could force a world to look, and that when a man with power chose accountability over comfort, it could begin to unstick long, stubborn, unexamined practices. And in the center that bore a name that carried both the weight of past injury and a promise of future repair, Fabricia stood among the people she had gathered. Eduardo came by sometimes not as a rescuer, but as a colleague. Tiago, who had never trusted theatrics, smiled at the pace of charity becoming instrument. The work went on, hearings, paperwork, quiet conversations, public education programs. They did not know everything, they had not solved every problem. But they had made a space where truth mattered and where those truths could be set into motion. If you were moved by this story and would like to see more narratives of resilience and justice, subscribe and watch the next emotional story we have prepared.